Game of Thrones was a television show based on a series of fantasy novels by author George R.R. Martin titled A Song of Ice and Fire. I say was very deliberately, as it seems to have almost completely dropped from the public consciousness. If you look for discussion about the series today, most of what you'll find is either forum threads mocking it or it being brought up in discussions about TV shows that completely fell apart at the end. This is often credited to the fact that the writers ran out of books to adapt and had to continue the series following a completely original storyline. But that alone wouldn't be enough to sink a project. No, the reason why Game of Thrones failed is that without the books, they didn't have a plan. It's widely believed that they were rushing to get the series finished so the writers could run off and work on that new Star Wars show. In all fairness, I don't envy the two guys who ruined Game of Thrones. They were given a nearly impossible task, that of finishing a pre-existing story with their own when they were never prepared to do so. The, still at time of writing, most recent book in the series came out 9 years ago, just after the first episode of the TV adaptation aired. I don't blame the showrunners for not anticipating that they'd run out of material over half a decade down the line, and not having a plan for when they did. Sure, the earlier seasons had deviations from the content of the books, most of it of debatable merit, but overall it seems book readers were mostly satisfied with the work, at least early on. But when you take an existing story, adapt most of it reasonably faithfully, and have to come up with your own ending for it, at that point, you're just guessing the intentions of the original author. It's a story born from speculation, and a story born from speculation can only be so cohesive. If you've read the title of this video, then you likely already know where this is going. There's another TV series associated with a written story that was unfinished at the time of its inception, and that series is Fullmetal Alchemist. It's likely that you've heard of this anime, or at least its more popular sibling, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, and I'm going to tell you right now that a lot of what you've heard is most likely incorrect. Hanlon's Razor states that I ought to give everyone else on the internet the benefit of the doubt and assume that none of them have deliberately misled you, and were simply mistaken. This courtesy does not extend to Jeff though. In order to speak the truth, I must first speak lies, and those lies are in the creation myth of the 2003 Fullmetal Alchemist. The story goes that Studio Bones had begun adapting the Fullmetal Alchemist manga, got about 27 episodes worth of material out of it, ran out of manga to adapt, and flew off the rails, where it revealed that the series took place in the real world, you yourself could grow up to be an alchemist someday, and the series ended as Hohenheim turned, looked right into the camera, made a gun with his fingers, and said, "Fuck you." I'll be the first to tell you that's not what happened. Even the stuff that's not obviously a joke isn't what happened. I mentioned specifically before that Game of Thrones, despite being pitched as an adaptation of a book series, contained differences from the source material. That last part is true for Fullmetal Alchemist. Even as early as the first seconds of the first episode, there are major deviations from the manga. For example, there's a shot of Roy Mustang on the hill outside of Resemble just before Edward and Alphonse perform human transmutation, which isn't in the manga, and is later followed up on during episode 3. This may seem like a minor difference just to keep the story moving, but not only would this be unnecessary as Brotherhood manages to adapt this part just fine, it's not revealed exactly why he's there until much later, and that difference is irreconcilable with the manga's story. At the end of episode 16, Edward speculates why Mustang must have been there that night, and context clues allow us to piece together what he would have been thinking.
Yeah, well, you think that was his actual reason, or was he coming for something else?
Episode 15 ends with Dr. Marco breaking the news to him that Winry's parents had been executed by Mustang during the Ishbalan War, and this weighs heavily on his mind during the following episode, particularly when he lashes out at Major Armstrong. Ed doesn't say it outright, but he was likely considering the possibility that Mustang was there to make amends with the Rockbells and tell them the truth of what happened to Winry's parents, as Pinocchio and Winry would have almost certainly been mentioned in the letters Ed and Al sent out. It's pretty clear from the implications here that faithfully adapting the manga wasn't in their sights by this point in the story, possibly as early as the beginning. But let's assume that the example I just gave is a little too speculative-y for your tastes. Episode 16 comes away into the series, and maybe it was a retcon, so who knows. What we need is something more solid, and something big. I'm not talking about minor stuff, like how Ed learns about Dr. Marco through his experience in Xenotime, rather than the comically absurd circumstances that conspire to throw him into the brothers' path in the manga. or how they meet Barry before his execution, or the rumor about the pocket watches, none of that. Those are all perfectly valid examples to be sure, but none of them are completely incompatible with the story of the manga. So let's look at something that is. In episode 13, the staff of Central Command arrives unexpectedly at Eastern Headquarters. As Mustang asks why, Führer Bradley arrives while both he and Boss Grund provide an answer. However, this explanation, which is ostensibly the very reason for this event to be taking place at all, is shoved off into the background while the camera zooms in on what may as well be a background character with no lines. This is accentuated by an uneasy rising of strings from the soundtrack and a Kulishavian cut back to Edward, who is clearly perplexed by what he's looking at. None of which I can properly show you because that's what got this video fucking copy struck. As it turns out, this is no ordinary background extra. Standing directly behind Führer Bradley is a character called Juliet Douglas, and she is the homunculus Sloth. In contrast to the benign and uninteresting origins of the antagonists of the manga, the 2003 Fullmetal Alchemist anime has the homunculi produced as the unintended byproduct of human transmutation. Said procedure results in the creation of something, but that thing is not the person that was intended to be revived. Instead, a new creature is born, and it is destined to die shortly after unless fed condensed human souls, usually in the form of red stones, eventually becoming, in most cases, a reasonably accurate recreation of the relevant individual as he or she was in life. This, naturally, raises the question as to whether or not these creations are, in fact, merely the failed results of hubristic alchemy, living creatures in their own right, or even possibly a genuine revival of the target, a thorny topic which the series lovingly explores from multiple angles, and is a major contributing factor in its beloved narrative depth. Regardless of their nature, throughout the story these homunculi are collected and kept in line by a woman named Dante, who uses them to control the country and manipulate people to her own ends, said ends being the creation of a philosopher's stone that she intends to use to cheat death. But Dante doesn't actually show up in the series until episode 32, so why does any of that matter? Because by having Sloth, of all characters, appear standing in front of Edward, it proves that the origin of the homunculi, the most defining difference between both versions of the story, had to be planned from at least this early on to some degree. The moment that Sloth walks on screen is the moment that there are no illusions about following the manga's narrative. The two versions of the story have hit the point of absolute and irreconcilable incompatibility, and no amount of similarity to the manga after this point matters for anything. And just to preempt any potential eyebrow raising, they didn't just make a mistake here and draw a character that looks exactly like Trisha Elric coincidentally walking behind Bradley in this scene, and then later scramble to invent a reason for her to be in the room. There's a flashback that directly precedes this scene where we see Trisha. The writers knew what they were doing, and they wanted us to know that they knew. For the record, do you wonder now where the manga was on the day this episode aired? I'll tell you. It was in Doubleth. Chapter 30 was released on the same month, in December of 2003. If it was true that the 2003 anime ran out of manga material to adapt and then started making things up as it went, then why would the biggest game changer of the entire series occur while there were at least 24 chapters of manga left completely untouched? Well, as usual, I have the answer and I'm going to tell it to you. Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 is a terrible adaptation, as it does not depict the narrative or themes of its alleged source material. However, the mistake is judging it as an adaptation in the first place. That's because it was never written, even from the beginning, to be an adaptation. I'd like to personally thank Reddit user Quizerotix for bringing this next piece of information to my attention. There's an interview with Seiji Mizushima, the director of the 2003 Fullmetal Alchemist anime, that's posted to the UCLA International Institute of all places, and an important excerpt reads as follows. When we started the Fullmetal Alchemist anime adaptation, there were only 1 or 2 volumes out during that time, so when I started the project, there wasn't pressure to be faithful to the original story. It was more about creating an original story that would last a full season. When we want to make an anime from an existing source, we have to decide whether that anime is going to stick very closely to the story of the existing manga, or if we want to use the art style of the manga to create a wider audience through the anime. so our approach to the original manga is going to change a lot based on which direction we decide to go in. As a director, I have to ask what type of anime this is going to be, if we're going to be doing a strict adaptation or an original story based loosely on the manga. So there isn't any one way to adapt a manga into an anime. And there it is. In case you still needed it, word from the man himself that the series was never intended to follow the manga. There is no divergence point. It was original straight from the get-go, with some events only vaguely resembling their closest manga counterparts. Bones never ran out of manga material. They took the bits they found compelling and wove them into a brand new narrative loosely inspired by the one that came before. Fullmetal Alchemist did not meet the same fate as Game of Thrones. To say otherwise would be
a common misconception not supported by facts.
Frankly, I'd say we're better off with Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 the way that it is. Mizushima and his team at Studio Bones worked very hard to make a strong series that would stand on its own, independent from the manga it was inspired by. And, against all odds, they actually stuck the landing, creating one of the most well-written and ambitious pieces of television in history. Aside from the rare hiccup, oddity, or straight-up bad episode here or there, none of which are something any work can completely avoid, it's a wonderfully told story with content that both complements and contrasts nicely with the other versions of Fullmetal Alchemist. It features themes of loss, unforeseen consequences, regret, redemption, and humanity. It's a darker series than its brothers, but not one without hope, and a bittersweet finale waiting at its end. And I wouldn't have it any other way.